In the previous lecture, we talked about CSS, and we primarily looked at it as a way to apply style rules involving things like font and color. But if you think about some of our design principles like unity and alignment and proper use of repetition, many of them involve layout, making sure that things occur in the right places on the page. So today we're going to talk about CSS properties that allow us to control the layout of the elements on a page. One of the reasons that we use CSS to do this is that this isn't something that can easily be done with markup. In the early days of the web, we primarily did layout using HTML, and the way that that was done was that you could change the order that elements appeared on the page by changing their order in the source file, in the HTML file. But otherwise, the only way to place something here and something else next to it was to use a table and sort of jury-rig a grid-based layout. So I could put a logo in one row and column of the table, and I could put footers in the bottom row, and I could put my content somewhere in the middle. And this worked, but it was really awkward, and it didn't give me much control, and it led to really bad code because I would sometimes have to embed tables inside tables to get things to fit just the way that I wanted. I would have to make things span multiple columns or multiple rows in order to fit nicely with other things on the page. Tables weren't really meant to be used for layout. Tables are meant to be used to represent tabular data, and so this wasn't a great solution. And it made it very difficult to move things around on a page and even to find your content on a page because there were so many extra tags for rows and columns and other kinds of layout-related markup that you couldn't find the content that you needed to change. The underlying problem was that HTML was simply too inflexible, too rigid to serve as a good way to do layout. So when they came up with cascading style sheets, they wanted to address this problem, and they added a whole bunch of neat properties that allow us to have more control over the layout. That's what we're going to look at today. But before we can talk about layout, we have to look at something else called the CSS box model. And this image shows sort of what the CSS box model is about. Every block style element on a web page consists really of 4 different parts. The content itself is sort of nested inside several other layers. Around the content we have padding. And around the padding we have a border. And around the border we have a margin. The main difference between the padding and the margin is that the padding is usually the same background color as the content, whereas the margin typically has the same background color as the things that surround the content. So it might be the background color of the container, for example, or perhaps the default background color of the web page. So all block level elements have a margin, a border, and padding, although often the border is invisible. It's there, it's just 0 width or something like that. Now when I say that dimensional properties, properties like the margin, padding, width, and height, only apply to block level elements, what am I talking about? You don't know, Dr. Marmerstein? You're teaching this class. Well, yes, of course I know. A block level element is an element that a web browser will typically expand to fill the width of its container. That container might be the web page. So for example, a paragraph tag is a block level element. A paragraph is usually the width of the page by default, or if it's inside a div, it'll expand to fill the width of the div. Whatever the containing element is, the paragraph will be just as big as that container. Block level elements are usually also displayed with space around them. What that means is that the web browser will start a new line when it starts a new block level element, and it'll insert a line break after the element to separate it from whatever comes after it. And block level elements are allowed to have dimensional properties. We can set the width and the height of a block level element so it doesn't, by default, or like it does by default, span the entire page or the entire width of a container. On the other hand, HTML also provides inline elements. Inline elements like the bold tag or the link tag, the A for anchor tag, don't take up physical space on the page, so they don't have dimensional properties. They typically adjust to fit the size of their contents, and they're displayed side by side with no line breaks between them. So block level elements have dimensional properties that we can adjust. By default, they expand to fit the width of the container, which might be the web page. They're usually displayed with space around them. Inline elements don't have dimensional properties. They're displayed side by side, one after the other, just laid out in the normal way from top to bottom, left to right on the web page. And the size of the inline element is the same as the size of the contents. As the contents grow, the inline element also grows. There's actually a third possibility. HTML supports the use of what's called an inline block element. These are like inline elements in that they don't have line breaks around them, and so they can be just sort of stacked from left to right. They're formatted and laid out to fit the normal flow of the page. But we can assign dimensional properties to them, so we can give them fixed width and height and margins and padding and other kinds of dimensional properties. So you can actually change whether an element is displayed as a block element, an inline element, or an inline block element using the display property of a CSS rule. So for example, an A tag is normally an inline element. An HTML link is normally an inline element because the text inside the link determines its width, and it normally doesn't cause any line breaks to occur, and the size of the link is the same as the size of the text. But I can change that. I can create a rule that says any A tag that has the ID block link, notice that there's no space between the A and the hashtag block link, A hashtag block link, any anchor tag or link with the ID block link should be displayed as a block element. Similarly, I can change a paragraph, which normally is displayed as a block element, and make it be displayed as an inline block element. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say any element with the class attribute set to inline paragraph. Notice there's a little dot in front of the word inline paragraph. That dot says this is a class selector. So any element in the inline paragraph class is going to be displayed using the inline block format. So here's an example of what that might look like. I've created some HTML that says this is a normal link, this is a normal link, this is a block link. This paragraph is displayed as inline block. Notice that the second paragraph lines up with it. If you look at the top of the page, the normal links are laid out inline. So this is a normal link. There's no line break before normal link or after normal link. The rest of the page gets laid out right after it. So this is a normal link. This is another normal link. No line breaks. But when I say this is a block link, the web browser actually inserts a line break before the word block link and inserts another line break after the word block link. Now ordinarily, if I had two paragraphs next to each other, there'd be a line break in between them, so the first paragraph would be above the second paragraph. But here, I've changed paragraphs to be displayed inline block. And so the first paragraph says, this paragraph is displayed as inline block. And the second paragraph says, notice that the second paragraph lines up with it. They're on the same line because they're inline block, not normal block elements. So the dimensional properties are really useful, and one of the most important ones is the margin. The margin is a usually invisible space around each element that separates it from the other elements on the page. And you can set the margin, or the size of the margin, using either the margin property or the four properties margin-left, margin-right, margin-top, and margin-bottom. I'm going to primarily show you how to use just the margin property by itself, but be aware that you can use those other properties to have more control over the layout of the page. So for example, suppose that I have an H1 tag. Remember, that's a level 1 header. That's a very important header that's usually displayed in a large font, usually a dark, bold text. And I'm going to set the margin around an H1 tag to be 200 pixels. So if I say margin : 200 pixels, it's going to set the margin in all four directions to be 200 pixels. The top margin, the bottom margin, and the left and right margins will all be 200 pixels wide. Similarly, I can style an H2 tag. I can say H2, and in my curly braces, I can have a rule for H2 tags. That's a second level header, not quite as big and bold and as important as an H1 header. I'm going to say margin : 200 pixels space 100 pixels. Now the first dimension is going to be applied to the top and bottom margins. The second dimension is going to be applied to the left and right margins. So my top and bottom margins will be 200 pixels wide. My left and right margins will be half that. They'll be only 100 pixels wide. If I provide 3 dimensions to the margin tag, like I've done for the H3 tag, I'm going to say margin colon 200 pixels, 100 pixels, 5 inches. Remember, I don't have to just use pixels. I have several dimensions I can choose from. What's going to happen is that the top margin will be set to 200 pixels, the bottom margin will be set to only 100 pixels, and both left and right margins will be set to 5 inches. I can also, of course, specify all 4 dimensions with the margin tag, and then I can control top, bottom, left, and right. But by default, if you only have 3 dimensions, it gives you a top margin, a bottom margin, and then both left and right together. So that's what this looks like. I realize this is a little hard to read. I'm sorry that I picked such a dark background. The top box has a margin of 200 pixels all the way around it. It's an H1 tag. The second box contains an H2 tag, the box in green. It has a 200 pixel margin on top and bottom, but if you look at the left and right margins, you'll see they're a little bit smaller than the top and bottom margin. They're only 100 pixels. The bottom box, the H3 box, has been styled so that it has 200 pixels on top, 100 pixels on the bottom, and 5 inches on left and right. That's not correct. Oh, I've styled it so the top margin is 20 pixels, the right margin is 15, and the bottom is 5 inches. Actually, I'm lying to you a little bit because it wasn't as simple as just making an H1 tag, an H2 tag, and an H3 tag and setting their margins. HTML and CSS have what's called the margin collapse problem. And the margin collapse problem actually isn't a problem. It's the way CSS is designed to work. But it can be confusing to new CSS developers. The margin collapse problem arises because by default, if you have an element inside another element, CSS will promote the inside element. What does that mean? It means that if I set a margin on the inside element, and there aren't any other elements within that container, the margin for the inside element will actually be given to the parent. So it'll be the containing element that gets the margin, not the contained element. That's very confusing, but I think that's because CSS is confusing here. The margin collapse problem is a real doozy to try to solve. So if I have a child element inside a parent element, I apply a margin to the child element, I expect it to give me a margin between the outside of the parent's container and the inside element, and that's not what I get. Instead, the child fills the entire parent, but the parent gets a margin separating it from the other things that it's next to. That's the margin collapse problem. There's different ways to solve this. One way is to just sort of sneak extra elements in, either really small elements that the user won't notice or even invisible elements. What I did is I stuck HR tags inside my divs so that they'd actually be separated. And if you look at the page, you'll notice those thin white lines between my H3 elements. That's to solve the margin collapse problem. That's not a great solution. Another solution is to just add 1 pixel of padding to the inside element so that it's not the only thing inside the parent, and then the margin collapse problem goes away. If you do a Google search, you can find like 12 different solutions to the margin collapse problem. You probably won't need to worry about that in this class, but if weird stuff is happening with your layout and you can't explain why, keep in the back of your mind that there's this weird margin collapse thing that might be causing the problems so that you can go look it up and figure out what you need to do. Or just email me and I can point you at the right resources. One of the dimensional properties is the margin. Another dimensional property is the border. The border is a usually colored box that we draw around an element. It fits between the margin and the padding. And by default, the border is invisible. It has width 0. But you can set a border property using CSS, or you can set the border color, border spacing, border style, and border width properties. And each of those properties also has a variation that allows you to set the border top, border left, border bottom, and border right subproperty. So for example, you could set like border width top and border width bottom and so forth. So here's an example. Suppose that I want to create an element with ID box. Maybe it's a div with ID box, and I want to give it a border. Here I've given it a border that is 10 pixels wide. It's a solid border, not a dashed border or anything like that. And it's going to be teal in color. So any element that has ID box will have a border 10 pixels wide, solid, in colored teal, which looks like this. and it says, here's a nice box. Notice that the border doesn't just fit around the text, it goes all the way to the edge of the page. The reason for that is that my div, in this case, is a block element. And block elements, by default, expand to fill their container. And since the container, in this case, is the web page, the border fills the entire web page. So if I were to make this element an inline block element, then I would get a box that only went around the words, here's a nice box. There'd be a nice line right after X, the side of the box. I've got margin, I've got border, I've also got padding. Padding is a usually invisible space around an element, but inside the border. Typically, if I set the background color of an element, that will set the background color for the content and also for the padding, but not for the margin or the border. The padding can be set using the padding property, or as with margin and border, with the padding left, padding right, padding top, and padding bottom properties instead. Here's a rule that takes all image elements and gives them 20 pixels of padding all the way around. As with the margin, we can set the padding to be 20 pixels all the way around the image, or we could have two dimensions. We could say set top and bottom padding to one value and left and right padding to another. We could have three values that specify top and bottom, top, bottom, and then the left and right padding. Or we could have a four-value padding rule that sets padding for top, bottom, left, and right. So here's an example of an image that has 20 pixels of padding all the way around. I think you can see if you look carefully at the image that there's 20 pixels of padding on the top, the left, and the bottom. It's a little bit harder to see that there's 20 pixels of padding on the right because I've made the background color of the content the same as the background color for the rest of the page. But if you look at the text at the bottom that says Rick on the soccer field, I'm sorry that's so hard to read, you'll notice that the R is about 20 pixels over from the image. That's because of the 20 pixels of padding. I think there's actually also some padding around the text Rick on the soccer field, but it gives you an idea of what this would look like. So here's a more sophisticated example. Over in the left column, I've given you an HTML document, and it has all the tags we talked about in the first couple lectures. We start with a doc type HTML tag, which says this is an HTML5 document. Then we say, okay, the HTML starts here, and it's in the English language. We have a head section that sets the character set to be Unicode, UTF-8, sets the title to CSS box layout, and then in green, we have a link tag that pulls in a style sheet named boxes.css. Notice that with the link tag, we use the href attribute, just like we do with links, with A tags. href stands for hypertext reference, and so it's the way that we specify a URL. So you can put any URL here, and it'll pull in a CSS style sheet for it. By the way, one of the things that means is that if you find a style sheet you like somewhere on the web, if you have permission, you can hot link to it, which basically means you can copy the URL and paste it into your code, and you don't actually have to download it to your own server or anything like that. It can use it just directly from the other website. We'll talk about some of the security implications of that at some point. There's an attack called cross-site scripting that we have to worry about a little bit. But this is, in general, a good thing. If I don't say http:// and a whole bunch of stuff in front, it'll just assume that I want to get a page from the same folder that the HTML document is in. So it's going to look for a boxes.css file in the same folder as my boxes.html file. Okay, that's it for the head tag. The link tag goes in the head section because it's not something that actually appears on the page. It's control information that tells how we want the page to look. In the body section, I've made 5 divs, box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5, and I've given each one a unique ID, box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5, lowercase. In the middle column and the right column, I've given you some CSS for styling the boxes. So first of all, I have a rule that says take all of the divs, all 5 boxes, give them width 50%. That means that they're going to take up exactly half the page. And text align center says that within that 50%, center the text. So my boxes are going to take up half the width of the page, and the words box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5 will be centered inside those rectangles. I'm going to give box 1 a border. It's going to be 2 pixels wide, and it'll be a solid blue border all the way around the box. I'm giving it 10 pixels of margin and 40 pixels of padding. I'm going to create box 2 with a green border. It's going to have a thicker border. It'll be a 10 pixel border, but it's also going to have 10 pixels of margin and 40 pixels of padding. I decided to give it a purple background color just to make it stand out a little bit, and I've made the text white because black text doesn't show up very well on a purple background. In the top right corner here, box number 3 is also going to have a green border, but it's going to be, again, just a 2 pixel border like box 1 had. I'm going to give it a margin 10 pixels by 20 pixels. So the top and bottom margins will only be 10 pixels wide, but we're going to have larger margins on the right and left. So it'll be twice as big a margin on left and right as on top and bottom. And by comparing it with the other boxes, you should be able to see the difference. Box 4 is going to have a green border. It's going to have 100 pixels of margin, so it's going to have a lot of margin all the way around. But it's only going to have 10 pixels of padding, so less padding and more margin. I'm going to give it a black background color with white text. Box 5 is actually going to be pretty much the same as box 3, except I'm going to give it a dashed border instead of a solid border, and I'm not going to make it white on blue. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. Here's box 1. Again, solid blue border, 2 pixel border, with, I think, 10 pixels of margin and 40 pixels of padding. Box 2, slightly thicker border. If we go back, you can see that it has, again, 10 pixels of margin, 40 pixels of padding. You can notice that the way that the border works, it looks like it sticks out a little bit further, but that's just because the border is thicker, not because the margins have changed. Box 3 actually has a slightly different margin on top and bottom than left and right. And if you look carefully, you can see that it has a larger margin on left and right, a 20 pixel margin on left and right, but it still has the 10 pixel margin on top and bottom. Remember, box 4 had a 100 pixel margin, but only 10 pixels of padding. So you can really see the difference that that makes. It has a lot less padding. And box 5 is pretty much the same as box 3, except with a dashed border. So one of the cool things that we can do with margins actually is called the centering trick. If you want to center an element within a container, and maybe that's the whole page, you want to center it on the page, you can do the margin auto trick. And all you do is you set the margin to be 0 auto. Actually, it doesn't have to be 0. It could be any value that you want. Maybe you want to have a 10 pixel margin on top and bottom. But the keyword auto has a special meaning to CSS. Basically what it'll do is it'll try to center the object on the page. It'll try to give it just the right amount of margin on the left and right so that it'll be centered in the page. So it tries to give it equal margin, kind of smush it into the center. A neat way to center things. However, this still doesn't give us a lot of control over the layout. But CSS has another way that we can do layout, and that's to use the position property. Now, by default, the position property actually doesn't do anything. You can set the position property and nothing will happen. What does the position property do? Well, if we turn on the position property, if we set it to something other than its default, which is static, then we basically enable 4 other properties that we can use to position elements on the page. And those properties are called top, bottom, left, and right. So if you turn on positioning, you can then use top, bottom, left, and right to specify exactly where things are going to go on the page. So position actually takes 4 different values, and what top, bottom, left, and right mean depends on what we've set position to. So if you set position to static, that's actually the default, and elements will be positioned according to the natural flow of the page. That is, they'll be positioned from top to bottom, left to right, in order. And block level elements will get a new line, and so forth. This is the default value. It doesn't give us a lot of control, but it actually works really well. And one of the things it does well is that if we have the web page and we change the size of the screen, it does a pretty good job of positioning things so that they wrap properly. If we change position, we're going to have to do that ourselves. Another option is to use relative positioning. So if you set the position property to relative, what that means is that if I set the top, bottom, left, and right properties, I can specify how far to move an element from where it would be positioned in the normal flow of the page. And the element will be offset by just a fixed amount. So other elements aren't affected by this shift. It basically pretends that the element is still where it normally would be, but it displays it somewhere else. So for example, if I want to style a div with the ID box2, I could give it relative position, and I could set the left property to be 10%. And essentially what that does is it'll say position this element 10% from the left of the container relative to where it would have been. So it's going to shift it over by 10% of the width of the container. One of the drawbacks of using relative positioning is that I'm moving this element, and I'm not exactly sure where it's going to wind up. It might actually wind up drawn on top of something else. And so that could mean that it hides something that the user wants to see, or it could be behind it and it could be drawn over so you can't see the element that you've repositioned. So to have control over that, we can use a property called the z-index. If you think about Cartesian coordinates like you study in math class, you have an x and a y axis. And you can specify a position using x coordinates and y coordinates. You can think of the z-index as being sort of another axis that comes out of the screen toward you. So as the z-index gets higher, elements get placed on top or in front of each other. As the z-index gets lower, they get placed behind each other. I think the default z-index is 0. So most elements get placed with a z-index of 0. If we give them a z-index of, say, 20, they're going to show up in front of everything else on the page. But if we give them a z-index of -4, or any negative value really, they're going to show up behind the other things on the page. And so you can decide what gets drawn over the top of what using the z-index. Another option is to use absolute positioning. With absolute positioning, we can specify with left, right, top, and bottom exactly where in the page we want to put an element. So the location is specified maybe in inches or pixels or something from the top left corner of the page. So for example, I could say, take the element with ID box3, use absolute positioning to place it, and make sure that it's exactly 1/4 of an inch from the top of the page and 1 inch from the right of the page. So it's going to be positioned in the top right corner. Absolute positioning positions things within the page. Now keep in mind that I can scroll a web page, and so if I've used absolute positioning to place something, when I scroll it might disappear off the top of the page. I might scroll past it. That's probably what I want. However, sometimes it's nice to position things relative to the screen rather than to the page that's being displayed on the screen. And that's what I can use fixed positioning for. If I use fixed positioning, the element's going to be placed at a particular location on the screen using the top, left, right, and bottom properties. So what this means is that if the user scrolls the page, the fixed element doesn't move. It stays right where it is. I might use this, for example, if I wanted to have a nav bar at the top of the screen, and as the user's reading their article or whatever, they can scroll down, but the nav bar will stay right at the top of the screen. They don't have to scroll back up to get to my nav bar. It has other features. Fixed positioning is kind of dangerous to use because if you're not careful, it can cover your other content, and the user might not even be able to get to it. They might not even be able to find a way to scroll far enough that they can uncover what they're trying to read. So you have to be very careful with fixed positioning to make sure you leave enough room that the user doesn't have to do weird tricks to try to access content that's hidden underneath it. So for example, I can create an element named box4. I can use fixed positioning to position it exactly 2 inches from the right of the page. Actually, I think in the example I'm about to show you, I positioned it 2 inches from the bottom of the page instead of from the right. But the principle's the same. So here's what this might look like. Box 1 I haven't changed at all. It's just in its normal place. Ordinarily, box 2 would go right below it. Remember, the div is a block level element, so we'd put a line break in, and box 2 would go directly beneath box 1. But because back here, I set box 2 to use relative positioning, and I said to move it 10% over from the left, it's actually shifted from left to right by 10% of the width of the page. Box 3 would normally go right below boxes 1 and 2. But I've used absolute positioning to position it in the top right corner, 1/4 of an inch from the top and 1 inch from the right, and so it's hanging out over there. Because I used absolute positioning, if I were to scroll the page, box 3 would go up off the top with boxes 1 and 2. Box 4 I've positioned with fixed positioning 2 inches from the bottom of the page, and so it's floating around, 2 inches from the bottom of the screen, so it's floating around at the bottom, and it'll stay exactly where it is even if I scroll the page up and down. I haven't applied any positioning to box 5, so it's just laid out in the normal way. Because I used absolute and fixed positioning for boxes 3 and 4, they've been removed from the normal layout engine, and so box 5 goes right below box 2. We don't leave spaces for boxes 3 and 4 or anything like that. We just put box 5 right where it would naturally go. So this gives us a lot of control, but it's kind of tricky to get right. It almost gives us too much control because we have to really think carefully about the design of our site and figure out exactly where we want to place elements with, say, absolute positioning. And it's not very flexible because if we resize a window or if someone pulls up a page on a screen that's a different size from the one we designed the site on, things are going to look kind of funny. They're going to be positioned in awkward ways. So another way to do layout is to use what are called floating elements. And the idea here is really simple. We're going to use the float property to tell the browser to take an element out of the normal layout algorithm. So all the other elements will still be laid out top to bottom, left to right, but this one won't be. Instead, it's going to take it and put it as far to the left or to the right as it can. And any other floated elements are going to be taken out of the layout and stacked next to the other elements. So we can float a whole bunch of things to the left, and they'll just keep getting placed right next to each other from left to right until we fill the container or fill the page, and then they'll wrap to the next line and keep stacking from left to right. We can do the same thing on the right. We can stack things on the right side of the page, and they'll just go from right to left until we fill the page. So for example, suppose that I have a div with the ID nav, and I tell the browser to float it to the left. I do the same thing with content, so I can float the content to the left, and I'm going to have a sidebar that I float to the right side of the screen. That might look like this. So here I've got my nav bar on the left. I've got my content floated next to it. And then I've got my sidebar, which I floated to the right. And in between them, I have a paragraph that I wrote. This is a really long paragraph that really should start on the next line. But because there are floating elements, it starts indented, which looks really ugly, which it does. So notice the nav bar and content got floated to the left. The paragraph, which was in the HTML document with them, has gotten shifted over to the right so that they will be all the way to the left, kind of to make room for those floated elements. And then the sidebar is on the right, and we've wrapped the paragraph to make room for the sidebar. So this looked really ugly. And the reason for that is that we moved that paragraph around. It wrapped funny because these other floated elements were in the way. If we want to fix that, we can use something called the clear property. Basically, the clear property says, when you display this element, make sure to give it clearance around any floated elements. So what it'll do is it'll look and see if there's any floated elements to the left, and if there are, it'll move the element down below them so that it doesn't get shifted over too far to the right or to the left. So here's an example of how I can do that. I can say hashtag description or pound description, clear : left. And that'll say take that description paragraph and move it so that it clears the floating elements on the left. I can actually set clear either to left, to right, to both, or to none, and it'll do the appropriate thing. So if I do that, this is what it looks like. My nav bar and my content div have both been floated over to the left, so they're stacked right next to each other. My sidebar has been floated over to the right side of the screen, but my paragraph now clears both of them. I told it to clear the left side, so it gets wrapped to the next line below where it looks a lot nicer. There are a couple CSS properties we haven't talked about yet that are worth knowing. In addition to being able to set a width, I can set a minimum width and a maximum width. And in that way, instead of saying it has to be exactly this wide, I can say, okay, no matter what size screen you're on, whether you're on a smartphone screen or you're on a big projector screen, make sure that this element is at least this wide. Or I can have a max width that says make sure it's no more than this wide. And if it gets to be this wide, then start wrapping lines or something. So I can have a little less control and give more control to the layout algorithm so it can be kind of smarter in how it lays things out. I can do the same thing with height. I can set a minimum height and a maximum height. I can also give things shadows. So this is kind of a neat effect. I can set what's called the box shadow, and it'll kind of make a drop shadow underneath the block level element that I'm styling. Or I can use text shadows and text outlines to do some kind of special effects on my current character set, my text. Some CSS selectors I didn't talk about in the last lecture are also useful to know. Some of them are called decorators. So any selector that has a colon in it, you know is a decorator. A:hover is a way that we can say, don't just match any link, but match a link that currently has the mouse over it. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's nice when the user puts their mouse over a link to give them some visual indicator of which link they're selecting, so that before they click, they know what they're clicking on. And so you might, for example, change the color of a link when the mouse is hovering over it. So a:hover will match all links, right? A tags are links, but only when the mouse is hovering over them. Similarly, if a user's already clicked on a link, the web browser can keep track of which pages have been visited, and if we're displaying a link to a page they've already seen, we can put that in a different color so that they can keep track of it and know that they've already been to that link. So the a:visited selector, or the :visited decorator, is a way that we can provide one color or style for links that have already been visited and a different color or style for unvisited links. The : before decorator and : after decorators are a little bit more interesting. When CSS lays out a web page, when it starts navigating a web page to figure out what goes where, it builds sort of a tree structure that says this is inside this, which is inside this. The before and after decorators will look at the elements that are next to each other in the layout. So for example, if I have a div that has 3 elements inside it, maybe the middle one's a paragraph, I could say, look at p: before and make it green. And what that would do is, instead of making the paragraph green, it'll look at whatever's in front of it in the div and make that green. Or I could say p: after and make that 12-point font. And it wouldn't look at the paragraph, but whatever comes after the paragraph, and would make that 12-point font. This is a little bit weird. One of the things that this is used for is actually inserting content into a web page using the CSS. It's a bit of a hack. The content property allows us actually to set the HTML for an element. So I can say p: before, content, and then in quotes, b example : /b. What this will do is it'll take every paragraph in my page, and it'll add a new element before it that has the word example in bold in front of it. So every paragraph will be labeled example. Similarly, I can say p: after, and I can add content after the paragraph. So in this example, I've created a bunch of @ in italics, and they're going to go at the bottom of every paragraph. So every paragraph, remember, it's a block level element, so we have a line break, and then there'll be a bunch of @ after it. Look really weird, but you could do it. So in summary, the elements of the CSS box model are the content, which is surrounded by the padding, which is surrounded by a border, which is surrounded by margin. We can use positioning to place elements, and the 4 different types of positioning algorithm are static, relative, absolute, and fixed. We can also float elements to the left or to the right, and we can use the clear property to make sure that they wrap properly. I hope you're doing well with Project 1. I think I'm going to push the due date back a little bit on that, but you'll get an email from me if that's the case. Make sure you email me if you have questions. Have a great day.